Okay, what's up, guys? Welcome back. Today's going to be a little bit different of a video. So, what I'm going to be doing today is giving you a pilot's reaction to the helicopter physics and handling of Squad. I'm going to preface this and say I'm not a licensed pilot, but I was a student helicopter pilot, and I have about 10 hours of flight time in both the Robinson 44 and 22 helicopters. So before we get started, I don't want to discredit my lack of certification necessarily, because I was able to effectively take off, fly, land, and hover those helicopters. And the reason I didn't finish that was because I realized the barriers that actually led to getting paid well. My flight instructor only made about $32,000 a year, and I was paying about $380 for the 44 to fly it. That was per flight hour, not including ground training. And so the cost was pretty steep because the 22 was down for all of those hours except for two of the flights that I did. So the 22 was substantially cheaper than the 44 because it was a lot smaller. And so with that being said, I have some seat time in the helicopter, and I've looked online and I couldn't find anyone else reacting or giving insight to how squad flight mechanics actually compare to the real world. And so without getting too technical, I'm going to go into that a little bit. So let's get started. I mostly fly the Mi-8, so I'm going to hop up in that real quick. We'll get it started. I'm on Jensen's training range. And we're going to give it a go. And so the first thing you can't really see in real helicopters, the collective, which adjusts multiple things. It adjusts the pitch of your blades or the rotors and your throttle. And most helicopters do both at the same time. So when you pull up the collective from the floor, raising it up, similar to how the gauge works on the screen, the helicopter blade pitch will change and also increase the engine and rotor RPMs. So that way you will pull more power from the engine and also be able to generate more lift with the propellers. This is the cyclic controls basically your axis rotation, and then the rotor, the pedals, basically anti-torque pedals, because the engine and the way a helicopter works, there's so much torque from spinning the rotors that if these pedals were not down here controlling the tail rotor, you wouldn't be able to even fly the helicopter. So this keeps it straight. So that's kind of just a general basics. But I still remember the feeling, and I still remember the responsiveness and controls. And so one thing to consider is that these helicopters are obviously way bigger and way heavier than the Robinson 44 or 22. So there will be certain things that most pilots won't be able to attest to unless you're in the military or flying giant helicopters like these. But a lot of it, physics-wise, will not translate. It just because the simple fact that this is not a flight simulator. This is more of an arcade mil-sim mix. And so we'll start it up. And once we get up in the air and get most of this noise out of the way so we can hear properly, then I'll start talking. Another thing about real helis is you're not going to just get in it and start it up. You're going to have to pre-flight it. And of course, this is a activity-driven game, arcade style. And so this is the pedals. This is how you would control the pedals. And there's no actual graphic, I don't think, for the... yeah, there's no graphic integration for the cyclic or the collective, because he's flying with both hands, and that's something that you don't do. And so let's start off with the collective. What makes you go up and down. So in squad, it's 0% to 100% collective. And in a real helicopter, you are not ever going to just ram collective as high as it will go. And hovering is not 50%. So in squad, hovering is 50% collective. And this is not even, yeah, it's not even the 50% mark, so 46%. That is not going to actually hover in a helicopter. When you're hovering a helicopter, you're making really, really tiny adjustments to all three controls in the helicopter at the same time. And it is the most difficult part of flying a helicopter. It was the one thing that I struggled with because I started on the 44 and then went to the 22, and hovering the 22 compared to the 44 is night and day, because the 44 is way heavier and bigger, and so wind doesn't affect it as much. And the controls, you can input more controls into the 44 without it being as sensitive or as responsive as the 22. So I saw this thing on Reddit a while ago. It basically compared flying helicopters in squad to flying an Olympic-sized swimming pool full of water. And I think that's a really good comparison, because you can do a lot of maneuvers in these helicopters that are not realistic whatsoever. You're not going to be out doing barrel rolls in a giant transport heli. You're not going to be doing J-hooks. It's just not, it's not feasible. And realistically, most helicopters, especially the 22 or 44, any of those like entry-level helicopters, if you try to do any crazy banking, you're going to destroy the helicopter and die. And so one thing, and I think it's the only thing that Squad does semi-realistically, is what is called effective translational lift. And so what that is, and to put it in simple terms, if you're hovering, the engine and rotors are doing all the work. They're sucking the air out of the sky, pushing it down. And so it's only the helicopter's lift. So really it's fighting the air to stay up, because there's zero forward airspeed. And so the helicopter's staying up on its own. And so what happens in a real helicopter, when you're taxiing to get to a runway, because that's generally what happens when you're at an airport flying a helicopter, you can't just take off from the helipad and willy-nilly out. You have to follow the flight patterns, and you have to taxi and take off on a runway like a regular airplane. And so when we talk about translational lift, basically if you're at a hover and you start to go forward, in squad you just drop down. Just a little dip of the nose makes you drop down. And so you can imitate what translational lift is a little bit. And so I'm going to do that. So instead of keeping the collective at the hover rate, we're going to raise it up, and we're going to give it a little bit more. And see, even at a higher collective rate, so I'm going to restart that. I didn't mean to do that. So we're going to get back to a hover, and we're just going to go full collective, and we're going to nose down a little bit. And so realistically, a helicopter, you're not going to get going this fast, but then when you pitch up, after you have that slight forward movement, you'll get going pretty quickly. But you'll basically be in this point where I'm going to try to get it as close to real as possible. So you go from a hover, slight nose down, and this is beginner stuff. And so you'll slight nose down, but this is really what will happen. So you're maintaining altitude, and what you'll do in a normal helicopter without adjusting the collective, you can pitch back, and you'll feel it plant you in the seat, and you'll start gaining altitude like this very quickly without doing much adjustment on the collective at all. And so that's one unrealistic thing about squad. Let's get closer to the ground here. And so what I do to kind of simulate this is I just full throttle collective. And then you can get really low and you can maintain. And then to imitate that translational lift, you can get going real fast. And if you want to get high, if there's a terrain coming up, you can similarly do that by leveling out the pitch. And just go like this, flatten out, and it'll lift up. Or if you want to do it even further, if you're getting chased by the new Loach helicopter, which can shoot you down pretty quickly, what I've done is if I get it going as fast as I can, and then I will just do this. And I mean, this isn't necessarily unrealistic, but it's not something that you would do. You gain altitude really fast. And so that's kind of the first part about the collective unrealisticness. The second part about that is if you are down, closer to the ground or even in the air, you can only pull, you have to keep the engine within power range, basically. And so there's not the correct gauges on this display to show really anything. And so, like, if you were to do this in a real helicopter, I mean, you could move it like this much, the collective, and get response, some very, very quick response. And of course, in bigger helis like this, you can move the cyclic more, so you can move it more back and forth like this, or forward and back. It's going to take more pilot input to actually produce movements than in a really small helicopter. Same with the collective. I mean, you just cannot be ripping on stuff like this. This is not how it works. And I think the squad has some of the absolute worst heli mechanics of any game I've ever played. And honestly, with the learning curve of how long it takes to fly efficiently, I only have 10 hours in the seat of a real helicopter, and I was able to take off, land, and hover, and fly in the air, which is the easiest part. In this game, to get familiar with flying, it took longer. Of course, stuff like hovering, there's nothing in hovering in this game. There's nothing to in-flight. But landing, because the collective does not give like realistic responses, like if I were to drop the collective like this in a real helicopter, it would just not be good. Same way if I was quarter, we'll call this not even a quarter to hover, depending on a lot of things actually that just are not important for this video. You can't just ram it up. There's just a lot of specifics with helicopters that operationally, but even at that, just the responsiveness aspect alone of it, this is not realistic. And I will say, if you turn your sensitivity all the way up, I wish I had a mouse tracker or a mouse cam. I'm barely moving my mouse at all, simulating the cyclic action. And this is pretty realistic to a real helicopter. When you're flying, you're not gripping it like this. You're maybe using, when I flew, my right hand laid on my right thigh, and I only held on to the cyclic with my index finger and thumb. You want extremely minimal inputs. And otherwise, you're just going to get into an oscillation. And so what happens with that, when you're learning to hover, we'll get closer to the ground here, just to simulate. This, when I first switched over to the R22, this is what it looked like, and I don't even know if I'm going to be able to imitate it because the way inertia is handled in these helicopters in this game. So basically, your goal is to pick a center line or pick an object in the horizon and keep the heading of the helicopter in line with that object. And so when I switched to the 22, I had this down in the 44 completely. But basically, it's going to look like a lot of this, unless you just nail it from the bat if you're a natural. You're going to be making adjustments, and if it's your first time trying to hover, you're probably making way too many adjustments, and you're going to start getting this pilot-induced pendulum effect. And this is pretty hard to counter if you're not careful, and it is way faster than this, and it's way harder to recover because you're going to be making inputs that are too heavy too quickly. And then so I remember at one point I was gaining altitude really fast, and I was making such small inputs is what it felt like. But you gain altitude and drop so fast with such minimal movements of the collective. And then you have to worry about the pedals too. And then so you could have a combination of things. Pilot-induced oscillations mixed with altitude that you're not keeping straight. And then the pedals on top of that, trying to keep your heading straight. And it's just kind of like this. And my instructor, the first time I flew the 22, let this go on for a while. And I remember I got an oscillation so bad that we were probably like, I don't know, 30 feet off the ground maybe. And I remember looking over, and then the helicopter was like banked like uncomfortably steeply for how little I had flown. So yeah, it's just not realistic at all. And this isn't to shy anyone away from being a squad pilot. I think it's a freaking irreplaceable role in the game. And if you have interest in flying, don't go onto a server and waste time killing people or wasting helicopters. It's just going to suck. It's going to make you look really dumb and probably even get you banned from the servers. So go to Jensen's training range like we're on now. Get your bearings down on how to fly. Make simple maneuvers. Watch a video, someone else's video on setting up your controls and how to fly. Maybe watch some J-hook videos. And I'm still not the best. I'd say I'm doing really good for how little hours I have. But you can't just go into a server and then expect to be doing stuff like this. It's just not going to work out very well. So that's kind of my non-pilot insight to squad flying. So it's nothing like real helicopters. So if you come from a different game and you love flying, you're probably going to hate it on this, at least initially. So you just have to keep trying. Don't give up on it. Because there were plenty, I'll recreate what my J-hooks looked like at first. I would even just try to land on here. And so a lot of times what would happen is before I knew what I was doing, I would go like this, and then I would do this, and then it just would end up like this, and then boom. So it takes some time to get used to it. And on top of that, the last thing that I think that they do decently well is the different responsiveness and handling of the different models of helicopters. This helicopter is much more agile than that helicopter, or the KA-27. I'll just show you. And the Loach helicopter, that thing is even more responsive. It feels the closest, I think, to flying a real helicopter in terms of the pedals and the cyclic. The collective, they just have it all messed up. And so I don't ever fly this one, so I'm not really used to it, I guess. But it's the cyclic. You have to I mean, it's still way more movement than you're going to be making in a real helicopter. But the pedal movements, it turns so quickly. Whoops. It turns so quickly on the pedals that it stops on a dime, and this is how it is. The collective, they just need to get that collective figured out. And I think if they got the collective responsiveness figured out, it would be next level for this game. Truthfully. So, if you want to fly, be prepared to spend several days, and I'd say at least 20 or 30 hours before you start going into servers and trying to fly. Because you might just be asking for some trouble for yourself. This handle's a lot different than the MI8. A little bit rough, but still on target. But that's my non-pilot insight to squad helis. All the veteran heli pilots out there, if I mess something up in explaining something, that's fine. Feel free to drag me. But don't give up. Keep flying. And just keep on going. Let's see if I can land this nasty one. Little rough. Really rough. But I got it. Alright. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Just a quick little insight video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think. And I'll see you guys on the next video.